Welcome, everybody. I'm Susan Kokinda. I work both with the Promethean Action organization, and I was recently elected as Coalition's vice chair of the Michigan Republican Party. So I'm wearing two hats today. This is the first of a series of town halls that we're going to be conducting, which really try and dive more deeply into the implications of President Trump's economic revolution. I do want to just introduce the fact that we do have a number of candidates who are here with us today, and they can stand up and wave. And I've invited them at the end of the presentation and discussions. If they want to say a few remarks at the end, they're welcome to do so. So I'll start with the local boys first. Christian Armstrong, running for Taylor City Council. Then moving up to a little higher level, Mike Cox is here running for governor of the state of Michigan.
Thank you. A little early to get to West Michigan, but thank you very much for having me. I couldn't miss you or him.
We appreciate that. What we're going to do today is explore President Trump's economic revolution from a number of standpoints, just so you get the order of battle. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks. Then I'm going to turn it over to Brian Panabaker, Autoworkers for Trump. Many of you have seen him on stage with President Trump in the Rose Garden on Liberation Day. And a lot of us know him on the front lines outside auto plants in 2024. And Brian just told me that we're going to be doing it again for the midterms in 2026. So everybody can re-up to get out there and help us and do that. After Brian, Tony Pappert from Promethean Action is going to give a bit of a historical perspective, because I think it's much easier to understand the implications both historically and economically of President Trump's tariffs policy when you look at it from the standpoint of the last time we did it, which was President William McKinley. So Tony's going to give us a brief picture of how this actually spectacularly worked at the end of the 19th century. And then I'm going to return and wrap it up a little bit. To start out, what I think we have seen over the course of the first 100 days is indeed absolutely revolutionary. And it does give us a pathway to win in 2026 and beyond. Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Howard Lutnick, Scott Bessent, they're frankly making my job as Coalition's vice chair of the Republican Party very easy, because they are fulfilling the pledge that I made when I ran, which is that we have to rebrand the Republican Party. It's a new party. It has to be the party of, as the platform says, manufacturing, industry, infrastructure, and workers. When President Trump was in Saudi Arabia, in the first speech that he gave, he actually, you wouldn't think this would come up in his speech to foreign leaders, but he made the point, this is a new Republican Party. And shortly after Liberation Day, President Trump said, I'm proud to be the president for the workers, not the outsourcers, the president who stands for Main Street, not Wall Street, who protects the middle class, not the political class, and who defends America, not trade cheaters all over the world. Now, that was matched by what I think was a really extraordinary speech by J.D. Vance that he gave in South Carolina, I think about 3 weeks ago, to a group of steel workers. And he reflected on his grandpa, who worked for 40 years as a welder at Armco Steel in Middletown, Ohio. And he talked about the pride that his grandfather had in this job, how when they would be driving around, he could point to every make and model of a car and tell you which parts were made in the steel plant that he worked in. And what JD said in this speech to the steel workers in front of him is, I hope you feel the same pride in what you're building. He said, but I hope you feel not just pride in the work you do. I hope you feel a little patriotic, because this is America's national heritage. It's making things. From Alexander Hamilton to Henry Clay to Ford's Auto Workers to the steel workers here this afternoon, America has always been a nation that builds the Empire State Building, the Hoover Dam, the Saturn V. And of course, we all know JD comes. This is his roots. This is where he comes from. But what I find even more delightful is that the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, sings the same song. And of course, he's gone through the entire pantheon of Wall Street experiences, hedge funds, even worked for George Soros at one point. Yet what you see with Bessent, what you see with Howard Lutnick is this administration is speaking with one voice. And Bessent gave an interview, I can't remember with who, about a month ago, where again, he's talking about the entire package that the Trump administration is putting forward. And he said, this is transformational for the American economy, for the American worker, and for the new Republican realignment. You notice a theme here? It's a combination of old and new ideas. Some of the old ideas were put away, but I always tell everyone, and they don't want to hear it, the original tariff man was Alexander Hamilton, and he used tariffs to fund the new nation and to protect American industry. And then he said something which I thought was really insightful. He said, you know, the Democratic Party has a strategy called compensate the losers. In other words, you lose your job, you lose the ability to raise your family on one income, which of course we used to have here in Michigan. In fact, we were the poster child for that. Detroit had the highest per capita standard of living in the country in 1960. Some of you already know the answer to this, but for those of you who don't, you want to guess what that per capita standard of living was in 1960? $8,000. And with $8,000, you could buy a house, you had a car, you'd probably be able to save up to buy a cabin up north, and you could raise as many as 12 kids, right? Because you had an economy which was actually productive. And that's what's been taken away from us for the past 50, 60 years. And the people who could have that kind of standard of living and with justified pride think that know that their children would have a better life than they would, that's been taken away from us. And what Bessent said is, I don't like and what the Democrats did is then, quote, compensate the losers with handouts and this, that, and the other thing. And what Bessent said is, well, I don't think the bottom 50% of Americans are losers. I think the system hasn't worked for them. And I think they are winners. And it's just a bad system. And we have to fix the system. And the point that I really want people to come away with today is that the Trump administration is very conscious of the fact that the system that we have worked under, especially for the past 60 years or so, go back to 1971 when we took the dollar off the gold reserve standard and ended the Bretton Woods system. What did that begin? That began a process where everything became a commodity. Our dollar became a commodity to be bought and sold. Healthcare became a commodity. Transportation became a commodity. It was no longer about delivering an actual service. Like the purpose of healthcare used to be to make you healthy. Now the purpose of healthcare is to provide an income stream for the HMOs and the insurance companies and big pharma and so on, which is why Bobby Kennedy Jr. is so radioactive to these people, because he's challenging a fundamental aspect of this financialization of everything. And we've done the same thing with our transportation industry. We've done the same thing with agriculture. In fact, anything you can put big in front of, big pharma, big ag, big tech, you're basically looking at this shift from being a producer economy to one where everything is simply parasitized for this financial income stream. And this is what the Trump administration is taking head on. And obviously the tariff question is a fundamental part of this, which Brian is going to talk about in a minute. And it's causing not only the potential for an economic transformation, and I'm going to come back to some of the aspects of that, but also a political transformation. The UAW has fully endorsed Donald Trump's tariff policies. Sean Fain has fully endorsed Donald Trump's tariff policies. Does he like Donald Trump? Does he like the rest of his policies? I don't know, and I don't care, because he knows that the future for his union and for auto workers is bringing good-paying manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Now, one of the things you'll see in the packet that you have is a 4-page white paper from the UAW, which I found really, really interesting because they started out, and I know Brian can address this as well, they looked at the plants that are simply underutilized. mean, we want to build new plants, and the Trump administration has got some pretty amazing tax incentives to do that. But we have a lot of capacity in the United States, which is being underutilized, like not too far from here, Flat Rock down I-75, 21% utilization, which means you could immediately, think of how many thousands of jobs you could immediately bring back to Flat Rock. Think of what that does for the supply chains that will feed that. So the UAW is very focused on this, and I think this is a very useful white paper. In fact, for candidates, I think you should look at where these plants are underutilized and make sure when you're talking to the audience in those areas, make the point, here's a place where we could immediately begin to provide, again, good paying jobs where one income can raise a family. Now, on the top of the packet, and again, this sort of reflects the political revolution going on, you have the Michigan GOP fact sheet on tariffs, which was put out under the new MyGOP leadership, so that Republican activists have got some basic ideas that they can use, some facts they can use to organize people who are being buffeted by the, oh, this is a tax on everything, it's going to cause a recession, and so on. So you have the UAW and the Michigan GOP, who are not really politically aligned with each other at this point, but nonetheless in the same lane in terms of this. And before I turn it over to Brian, I just want to conclude my opening comments with something that Scott Bessent said, which I think really captures the essence of the kind of shift we have to cause in the way people think. Because my contention is if we can get our fellow citizens thinking again like producers, as opposed to thinking as consumers or victims or some narrowly defined identity, but think of people who are proud, as J.D. Vance said, as his grandfather was, in building big things or participating in an economy that does big things like the Hoover Dam, like the Transcontinental Railroad, like the Saturn V, and now the things that Donald Trump has on the agenda. I think people are going to make the right decisions in 2026. It's really a change in identity. And Bessent said it in an interview, I think, with Laura Ingraham, where, you know, we've all heard this, oh, the dolls are going to cost much more on Amazon. And, you know, he just said, look, maybe you'd be better off with only $2 instead of $30 because your children are going to have a better future. And I think that's the point. It's that change in orientation. So the tariff question is a fundamental part of it. I want to invite Brian to come up and tell us from an auto worker's perspective. Look that way, Brian.
Sure. Well, thank you, Susan, and thanks to everybody that's here. And I'm going to take close to 20 minutes to speak to you folks today. So I want to take the first 8 or 10 minutes to give you sort of an overview of who I am and what my perspective is and where I'm coming from. I'm a retired UAW member. I worked 25 years for Ford Motor Company. Prior to that, I'd worked 11 years for Chrysler Corporation. So when I worked at Chrysler, and this is going to sound crazy, but I worked out of the world headquarters, the old world headquarters, which was in Highland Park. And I was assigned as they needed me in the department that I worked in to different plants over the 11 years I worked at, believe it or not, 11 different Chrysler plants. A lot of those are closed now. And I eventually took a buyout and left there and then spent a few years kicking around before I got hired at Ford Motor Company. So I have a combined 36 years between Chrysler and Ford Motor Company. What that gave me was a pretty good perspective about all the different types of auto plants there are. There's not only assembly plants, which Susan in their white paper here has listed. I believe all of those plants listed in there are assembly plants. But what you have to keep in mind is for every one of those assembly plants, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler have axle plants, stamping plants. They used to have glass plants and different tooling plants. A lot of those plants are affected too by government policy. Unfortunately, that government policy over the last couple of decades has driven jobs out of our country. Ever since NAFTA was passed actually, in 1994 when it was signed into law. Ross Perot's prediction was proved true. We heard a giant sucking sound, and that was all of our manufacturing jobs leaving the country and going to Mexico. So I've seen a lot of this. I've witnessed a lot of this firsthand. I've been affected by a lot of this, and that's where I'm coming from. Now, in terms of Donald Trump and his policy, specifically his tariff policy, I had the good fortune of meeting Donald Trump in Novi back in September of 2016. He was not yet the president. He was running for his first term. And I was getting my picture taken with him backstage in Novi. And as I stepped up to meet him, I said, Mr. Trump, we have the keys to the White House waiting for you in Macomb County. And he kind of chuckled. He knew I was up to something. And he said, oh, yeah, how's that? And I said, well, Macomb County is the home of the Reagan Democrats. That's what we were known as at that time. And I said, if you come to Macomb County and ask for the Reagan Democrats support and you get it, you might win Macomb County big enough to carry the whole state of Michigan. I said, Mr. Trump, if you win Michigan, we both know what that means. You win the White House. So he turned to his aides off to the side and he said, when we come back to Michigan, can we go to Macomb County? And he pointed at me. And they said, yes, sir, if you want to. So Donald Trump turned to me, poked me in the chest real hard. I'll never forget it. And shook my hand real firmly and said, when we come back to Michigan, we're coming to Macomb County. He got it. He got it immediately. I could almost see the light bulb go on over his head. Now, the Reagan Democrats, when you heard that term back then, that was basically referring to the UAW members who had been told by their union leadership for decades, vote Democrat because they'll protect your jobs. You know what? That was the exact opposite of the truth. They were voting for Democrats who were pushing policies, including high taxes and trade policies that were driving our jobs, if not out of the Midwest, down south to non-union states, right out of the country to Mexico. So that was a bald-faced lie. Well, around 1980, American voters started to wise up to that, and they realized the Democrats have been lying to us. And I would submit, this has really happened since Trump took office, yes. But the process began when Ronald Reagan was in office. He was the beginning of that transition. And I no longer refer to the Reagan Democrats as Reagan Democrats. I refer to them now as Union Republicans. These were union members whose values aligned with the Republican Party platform, but they continued to vote for Democrats in spite of their values and their beliefs for decades, really, because the union leadership told them to. But you can only lie to somebody for so long before they finally realize that what they're saying to you is a bald-faced lie. Well, when Donald Trump finally came along after 40 years after 30 years at least after Ronald Reagan, he reinforced the fact that the union leadership had been lying to them all along. Then it was like an avalanche of lights going on, and they jumped over and started voting for Donald Trump, and that's how he surprised Hillary Clinton in 2016. She didn't even step foot in Wisconsin during that campaign. She thought she had Michigan in the bag. The entire Rust Belt, where all our manufacturing jobs had left the country, they referred to as the Rust Belt, and it was Hillary Clinton's blue wall. She thought, we got the blue wall up in the Rust Belt. I can't lose that, so I don't need to even go there and campaign. Big mistake. Donald Trump realized how critical the blue-collar working class people were in the election. He campaigned hard in the Midwest, and we all know how that turned out. Donald Trump made history. So I had got to meet him during that campaign. I reinforced the importance of a critical county like Macomb County, Michigan. He already knew it, but I kind of highlighted it, and he never forgot that. So they started inviting me and my organization, Autoworkers for Trump, to his rallies. And as you know, he continued to do his rallies while president, which surprised a lot of people. But I would take 20, 30, 50 sometimes UAW members to his rallies. I had shirts made up like this one, but in red. We would sit up around the stage, And Donald Trump loved having us there because he knew we were the backbone. We were his base. He wasn't looking to the Wall Street financiers or the East Coast and West Coast, Hollywood, the elites. He was looking to Main Street, and he loved having us there. So every time I'd take a group of people to his rallies, they'd let me go backstage, get my picture taken with him. And he likes to talk. And even more than that, he likes to laugh. So him and I would start talking and joking around with each other. And the next thing you know, we kind of became friends after a few visits like that. So I've got kind of a long distance friendship with Donald Trump now. And I've been to the White House a couple of times. I'm gonna be going again to the Oval Office. Prior to the 24 election, I asked the campaign manager for the state of Michigan, if we won Michigan, and only if we won Michigan in 2024, can I bring a group of my UAW members to the White House to go into the Oval Office like they take the Super Bowl teams and the World Series champs and get a picture taken around the desk with Donald Trump, and so my guys could meet him, shake his hand, get a picture with him. And they said, Brian, if we win Michigan, of course you can. So I still got that trip coming up. They called me for the April 2nd tariff announcement to see if I could bring 20 UAW members to the White House and for his tariff announcement in the Rose Garden. So I was able to pull that off from Florida. I had to make a lot of phone calls and text a lot of people because we had to pay our own way, get our own airfare, make our own accommodations. But we did it because these guys really love Donald Trump as much as he loves them. So we made that trip. We're going to be going back again for an Oval Office visit sometime in the next couple of months. But that brings me around to his tariff policy. Out of all the counties in the state of Michigan, Donald Trump came to Macomb County, Michigan for his 100th day in office. Out of all the people he could have brought for his tariff policy announcement, he featured the auto workers. So here we are. We're at ground zero for Donald Trump's support and the people he wants to help the most. So the candidates that are in the room today, I strongly advise you to emphasize the things that Donald Trump is campaigning on, which is the return of our manufacturing base back to this area, which is where his tariff policies come in. Now, I've witnessed it over the last 35, 40 years, plant after plant after plant closing or going from 3 shifts down to 2, maybe 1. Supplier plants are closing. Since NAFTA, they've been reopening down in Mexico because they can pay people $5 an hour down there as opposed to the UAW negotiated wage. So people are really feeling this in their everyday lives. You can really strike a chord with them. If they voted Democrat in the past or they haven't voted because they're fed up with politics, Donald Trump is bringing a new, fresh approach to Washington, D.C. And we can bring it back here to the state of Michigan, too, because people that have been affected by government's horrible policies, whether it's trade policies, tax policies, they know firsthand, they felt it over their 20 or 30 year period. Their families have felt it. So tariffs are going to force these automotive companies, the domestic automotive companies, to bring the plants that they've moved to Mexico back into the United States because they won't be afford to pay these high tariffs that Donald Trump is putting on them. It won't be worth it. It won't be profitable. So they really have no choice. You can either keep your plant down there and pay slave wages to a Mexican workforce, or you can move the plant back where it probably originally came from, whether it's Michigan, Ohio, or Texas, Tennessee, wherever, and pay 0 tariff. But you have to pay a living wage in that area. So they're going to have to make that decision. He paused all of his tariffs for 90 days to give the companies time to think about this and to let it sink in. And when they come to the realization that this is kind of a no-brainer, we've got to move our facilities back into the United States. We got away with this for 30 or 40 years. We've been screwing the American workforce out of their jobs so we could make more and more money. but those days are over. And Trump is not playing. I mean, he's playing hardball with these people. He gave them 90 days to let them think about it, but now he's sitting down with these different countries and making new trade agreements, opening up their markets to our products and forcing them to come to the realization that the companies that are located in their countries, like in Asia, Nissan, Honda, Toyota, Hyundai, in South Korea, and then in Europe, you've got BMW and Volkswagen, big automotive companies that are going to have to build plants here in the United States if they want to sell into our market. They've been getting away without doing it for a long time, but now even their parts supply chain is going to have to relocate here. You know what the transplants like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan did for a while to kind of placate the UAW was they build an assembly plant here, like in South Carolina or Tennessee, somewhere down south where the UAW was not strong, but they still got all of their parts shipped over from their home country. The jobs stayed there, the parts got made there and shipped over, and then they just assembled it here, and they tried to make us think that it was an American-made vehicle. Well, it really wasn't. All the components came from outside the United States. So Trump is forcing them to bring not only their assembly plants here, but their parts plants as well, their axles, their stamping plants, their everything, their seats, their upholstery, their glass plant. Everything's got to be sourced in the United States, or they're going to pay a prohibitive tariff on it, and it won't be cost effective for them to keep shipping it into the United States. So this is a beautiful, well thought out plan. Susan mentioned the great team that Trump has put together with Scott Bessent at Treasury and the rest of his trade negotiators. They know the intricacies of the auto industry and the trade policies. They have thought this through. Trump had 4 years when he was out of office to come up with a game plan. He knew what he was going to do from day one. He hit the ground running, and it kind of caught the Democrats and the media by surprise. But Trump is putting on a master class right now of how to revamp American manufacturing, and he's doing it with tariffs, forcing the manufacturers to bring their production back into the United States. And as somebody who's seen a lot of those auto plants around the Detroit area, I can tell you it's long overdue. And I'm really, really loving every single announcement he makes because I see where it fits in to his overall plan. So I know Tony over here is going to speak about the tariff policy and how it made America strong, wealthy, and powerful 120 years ago around the turn of the century. But from an automotive worker standpoint, this is a phenomenal, fantastic development, and we have to seize this opportunity. So I know Promethean has been very active in helping local candidates run for office, gain seats. We have to work with them. We have to give them our time. This is an opportunity that probably will never come along again. So believe me, everything you guys do, and I know from personal experience how much Promethean helped me when I was doing auto plant rallies for the entire 2024 campaign. I did 22 different auto plant rallies, one every week outside the auto plants to communicate with the UAW members and to motivate the guys who were already on board with us, which was about half of them, and then to educate the other half who weren't. And we have a real easy case to make, guys. I mean, it's very obvious who they should be voting for. Conservative Republican policies, especially the MAGA Republican Party policies, really, really help the blue collar workers. So it's an easy argument to make. All of us need to be out there talking to our sphere of influence, whether it's our friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, trying to educate them. Susan does a great job with getting you the facts, the information. Get out there, present the facts and the truth to people in your sphere of influence. Help these local candidates win their races. We have to win the midterm elections. If we lose the majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, they will immediately introduce impeachment papers against Donald Trump. They're going to try and do it again. So we are living in a historical time where we have to get out and work. You know, I told the folks at the rally on Trump's 100th day in office up in Macomb County that the campaign for the 2026 election starts tomorrow. Well, it does. It starts tomorrow for us. We have to get out there. We have to volunteer. We have to work our sphere of influence. We have to help not only local candidates, but we have to help statewide candidates like a candidate Mike Cox right here is running for governor. We have to help folks like that. We have to help national candidates, people that are going to go to Washington, D.C. There's a Senate race. There's also congressional races on the ballot in 2026. We have to win those races. We absolutely have to win them.
All right, Tony.
William McKinley, who was a Republican from Ohio, was America's 25th president. He was president from 1897 to 1901. He was assassinated in 1901 at the beginning of his second term, just like Abraham Lincoln, who was his hero and his model for his whole life. McKinley was the last U.S. president to have fought in the Civil War. And McKinley was a lifetime fighter for protective tariffs. His reasons for supporting tariffs resembled very much those of President Trump. He's in 1885, he said, when he was a congressman, I think, he said, "Reduce the tariff and labor is the first to suffer. He who would break down the manufacturers of this country strikes a fatal blow at labor. It is labor I would protect. We do not want 50-cent labor." And he said in 1890, with me, again, to Congress, where he was a congressman, he said, "With me, protection is a deep conviction, not a theory. I believe in it and thus warmly advocate it because enveloped in it are my country's highest development and greatest prosperity. Out of it come the greatest gains to the people, the greatest comforts to the masses, the widest encouragement for manly aspirations, with the best and largest rewards for honest efforts, dignifying and elevating our citizenship, on which the safety, the purity, and the permanency of our political system depend." And at the University of Pennsylvania, he gave a speech called Cheap Goods. And he said, and listen to this because people are saying exactly this today. They say everything would be so cheap if only we had free trade. Well, everything would be cheap and everybody would be cheap. I do not prize the word cheap. It is not a word of hope. It is not a word of comfort. It is not a word of cheer. It is not a word of inspiration. It is the badge of poverty. It is the signal of distress. And there is not a white-haired man in the audience who, if he will let his memory go back, will not recall when things were the cheapest, men were the poorest. Cheap? Why, cheap merchandise means cheap men, and cheap men mean a cheap country, and that is not the kind of government our fathers founded, and it is not the kind their sons mean to maintain. If you want cheap things, go to where you can get them. We want labor to be well paid. In 1890, as a congressman from Ohio, McKinley put through the McKinley Tariff, which raised rates to 40 to 50% for industries we wanted to protect. Again, this is just an average. And there were many, tariffs were not put under McKinley on many things, which are not most things which can't be made in the US, like bananas, coffee, pineapples, all these kinds of things. These didn't have tariffs. So, and, tariffs varied by industry, but the tariffs were for industries we wanted to protect so we could manufacture. I mean, there were others, very briefly, there were other kinds of tariffs called revenue tariffs, because before the income tax came in, at the time of the First World War, most federal revenue came from tariffs. So there were tariffs put on products purely for the purpose of revenue. But McKinley personally opposed that and supported tariffs for things we want to protect and not other products. So the McKinley tariff, named after him as a congressman, raised rates to 40 to 50% for many industries in 1890. Then the Democrats came in and cut many of these rates in 1893, although tariffs still remained much higher than any of us. Then in 1897, under McKinley, the Dingley tariff raised many rates still higher, above 50%. This was named after Congressman Dingley, whose great-granddaughter, great or great-great-granddaughter, I just met a few nights ago. So now, I mean, the results of the tariff were the kinds of things McKinley expected. During the peak tariff years of 1896 to 1901, under McKinley, U.S. steel production increased by 111%, more than doubled. U.S. electrical equipment production increased by 271%. It almost quadrupled. Farm equipment production increased 149%. U.S. coal production rose 800%. U.S. railway track mileage rose by 567%, almost 7 times. Wheat production, U.S. wheat production rose by 256%. By 1900, America was the world's leading energy producer and consumer. We had 245,000 miles of railroad track, and we even had, this is by 1900, 14,000 automobiles on the road. McKinley was the first president to ride in an automobile. By 1900, there were over 1.5 million telephones installed, and McKinley was the first president to have a fully electrically wired White House. Again, just results here. U.S. steel production. In 1880, 1.3 million tons. In 1900, 11.2 million tons. In 1910, 28.3 million tons of steel. By 1900, America was making more steel than Britain and Germany combined. These were the two leading industrial powers in the world until we came along. Glass production. In 1870, there was no domestic production of plate glass, no domestic production of polished glass. In 1890, 20 years later, 97% of our plate glass was produced in America, 82% of our polished glass was produced in America. The total number of American glass factories went from 169 in 1879 to 355 in 1899. With new technological breakthroughs, America would revolutionize glassmaking by 1910. Tin plate. This is extremely important. In this period, oil was transported in tin plate containers. In 1889, we had 0 tin plate mills. In 1891, we had 20. 1896, we had 75 tin plate mills. In 1900, we had 200 tin plate mills. So this is a period of 11 years. We went from 0 to 200 tin plate mills. Now, McKinley did something else, which is very worth thinking of. For each of these industries which were protected, a federal commission was set up to evaluate the effects of the tariff, so that the tin plate manufacturers were told within 6 years, either they produced 30% of U.S. consumption of tin plate or the tariffs would be taken down, right? They were told they had to reinvest in their industries rather than what we would call today stock buybacks. They were told they had to raise wages in their industries. So all these things were evaluated by tariff commissions with the rule that the tariffs would be ended unless manufacturers fulfilled these conditions, and tariffs actually were ended when they failed. And then, I mean, just to conclude, from 1877 to 1901, in the United States, real wages rose by 53%, in large part because prices fell. I know there are people who tell you that tariffs raise prices, but in the US from 1877 to 1901, prices fell by 58%. And that's the biggest reason why real wages were able to rise so much. Union membership quadrupled under McKinley's term, 4 to 5 years. It's brief, but true. Tariffs have worked.
Thank you. I just want to conclude by addressing a couple of other elements of this. I want to make the point that tariffs are part of an overall strategy from this administration, which has both domestic and international components to it. And it's not just tariffs. I mentioned a few minutes ago that this question of the financialization of our economy began in 1971. Well, you can actually go back a little bit earlier and segue right off of what Tony talked about, because of course McKinley was assassinated in 1902. I bet most of you know what happened in 1913, right?
Income tax.
And Federal Reserve, right? And the two essentially went hand in glove. And that was really the first step in undoing what in the 19th century had been known as the American system, which J.D. Vance, other people are now explicitly referring to. I want to just focus on this for just a minute because the question of the American system is extremely important, because the economic debate for most of our lifetimes, and probably for most of the 20th and 21st century, has been shaped on the basis of a phony confrontation, which is capitalism versus communism. Now, let's do a little bit of historical back check. What did we fight the American Revolution against? We didn't fight the American Revolution against communism. It didn't even exist. Karl Marx popped up about 60 years later, because the American system was based on the conception that you organize your economy about increasing both your physical production and the productive powers of labor. And just think of what Tony just said in terms of what happened to this country under the McKinley tariffs, both from the standpoint of the increase in manufacturing, wage levels, and I'm sure the skill levels as well of the American worker. This phony dichotomy that it's communism versus capitalism, or it's big government versus little government, is one of the things which is going to cripple us in 2026. Because if people operate from this standpoint, you're not going to understand what Donald Trump is doing, and you're not going to be able to support him. Like the handful of Republican congressmen yesterday who just voted against the big, beautiful bill in one of the committees, right? And why did they do it? Because they want to cut the budget. Because they think the only way to get out of this crisis is to spend less money. And what Donald Trump knows is the way ultimately you're going to get out of this crisis is by producing more. And that you are sometimes going to have to spend money to do it, right? Which is why he doesn't have his panties in a bunch over raising the debt ceiling. Because temporarily, we're probably going to have to raise the debt ceiling until we ramp this stuff up. Okay. Building a new factory is not going to happen tomorrow. Although I will say that the Trump administration is doing some amazing things in this in the big, beautiful bill. They have a provision for full expensing for a new factory. What does that mean? It means if you're going to build a new factory, you deduct the entire cost of it in year one. You don't amortize it over 40 years, which is the way it currently works. And now we've had full expensing for buying equipment. We've had full expensing for research and development. That was one of the things. Kennedy had investment tax credits and so on. This is the first time that I've been able to find in American history that you actually have a proposal for full expensing for the entire factory. And it's just for manufacturing factories. If you want to build a distribution facility for your pot warehouse, you ain't going to get full expensing under this. But what you see from the Trump administration is they really are thinking in a completely different way. It's not about money. And in fact, Besant also made the point that 90% of investors in the stock market are small individual investors, and they're not panicking. They're staying put. The people who are panicking and screaming about instability this and recession that are the big institutional investors, in other words, the financier parasites, who make their money by being able to game the markets, as opposed to the way that it used to be, which is you worked for Ford, you bought some Ford stock, Ford made a better product, the stock prices went up, you held on, and maybe when you retired, you sold them for your retirement income. but you are actually invested in a productive activity. But what the Trump administration is doing with tariffs, with tax policy, and an absolutely amazing executive order on vocational education, which they announced on April 23rd. Get this. Within 120 days of the date of this order, the Secretaries of Labor, Commerce, and Education will submit to the President a domestic policy, the purpose of which will be to come up with a plan to reach and surpass 1 million new active apprentices in the trades in the United States. Because if you're going to start building factories, if you're going to start building the supply lines, you actually have to have skilled, educated workforce. And of course, this also addresses something I think extremely important in terms of the cultural idea, which is, especially with the younger generation, we do have a few of them here, where you saw the biggest demographic shift for Trump in terms of Gen Z. Why? Because they know that this system doesn't work for them. They have no future. They'll never own a house. Hell, they'll probably not even be able to own a car under the old system. And so they see in Trump, even if it's only hazy, they see the potential for the emergence of a new system based on real, genuine, productive labor. And so you take the question of the trades. There's actually a project it's small and it was in place before Trump got there, but there's a federally funded program, which is either at Macomb or Oakland, I'm not sure which one, where you take a 17-week program. You go to work at 7 a.m. in the morning, you get off at 3, just like you were working in a machine tool shop, and you come out with a welder's license or a CNC license, which means you can move right into an apprenticeship program. And before you know it, you're going to be pulling down $80K a year with no student debt, right? So this idea of 1 million apprentice jobs shows you that this administration is thinking in a completely different way than the way our economy and our society has been run increasingly over the last decades. And again, you really can trace it back to 1913 with the Federal Reserve, but that's another story. This is why I'm saying this is systemic. This is a revolution. And when you go out and you talk to people about these kinds of ideas and you activate their productive identity, again, where they stop thinking like a consumer or somebody who can be manipulated based on some identity politics or a victim, but rather a producer that has power over changing nature, making the country better, and creating a future, I have no doubt that people are going to figure out who to vote for in 2026. We will combat the Democratic Party lies. We will have to run a robust get out the vote campaign. We will have to do all due diligence on election integrity and all of those things. But if people are thinking from a different standpoint, they're going to figure a lot of this out themselves. And we saw it when we went to the auto plants during the UAW strike. There was no difference between the support for Donald Trump from the workers out in the suburbs at Wayne Assembly than the workers who were mostly from the city of Detroit down at the Stellantis plant on East Jefferson. More than 50%, both plants, same level of support for Trump, because they all had a producer identity. They didn't need Sean Fain to tell them who to vote for. They didn't need Kamala Harris to tell them who to vote for. They didn't believe that Trump was pushing Project 2025. They knew what he was doing because they knew who they were. And I think that is the mission that we have in 2025, is to intensify this dialogue, rebrand the Republican Party as Trump wants to, as the party of workers and industry. We have to do that now in 2025.
So Donald Trump has tapped into this common theme. We all need good paying jobs. And the only way to achieve that is by rebuilding our manufacturing base. And that's why he spent so much time here in the Midwest, in Michigan and Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, because that's where all those manufacturing jobs were and where they were lost. And he knows that his tariff policy, his trade policies, his tax policies, and all of his entire agenda will bring jobs back to the Midwest. The common thread is jobs, 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 jobs. So this is what Trump is going for because he knows it's a broad-based appeal to different people in different communities. So we need to really stress that as we get out there and in our grassroots efforts, support candidates and try to change people's thinking. These meetings are just where you get the information, where you get energized. Now you all need to go out. And I say this at any event that I'm asked to speak at, you guys are the hardcore believers. You're the ones with the information. You have the information in these packets that Susan gave us. Now go home and talk to your family, talk to your aunts and uncles. Everybody says, well, I got this one aunt, she's going to vote Democrat till the day she dies. Well, if you let her, she will. But if you educate her, she may not. Some of these people are reachable. And once people become informed voters, they're gonna probably vote Republican because we have the truth and the facts on our side.